The city, like so many things of value, belonged to Leo Valerius. Its glittering skyline was a monument to his empire, and its shadowed underbelly, the source of his power. The financial streams of 1,000 businesses, legitimate and otherwise, flowed into his coffers, a silent, dark tributary system he monitored with an accountant's precision and a tyrant's finality. It was this precision that had flagged a minor irregularity, a tiny, stubborn red number in the ledger of a small, struggling art restoration studio. It was the kind of debt most underbosses would handle with a routine, brutal visit from collectors. But Leo was not most underbosses. He was the sovereign, and the report had included an intriguing footnote: the proprietor had not begged or bargained. She had simply listened, nodded, and promised payment with a calm that bordered on indifference. Curiosity, in a man like Leo, was a dangerous and possessive thing. Juliet Vance stood in the echoing marble foyer of the Valerius Tower, feeling the immense weight of its sterile opulence press down on her. The air smelled of lemon polish and cold ambition. She had been escorted here not by thugs, but by severe men in impeccably tailored suits who spoke in polite, unyielding tones. This, she understood, was a different order of threat. It wasn't the loud, explosive danger of street enforcers, it was the quiet, suffocating peril of absolute authority. Her studio's debt was a pebble to these people, but the principle of its existence was an affront. As Marco, a man with the weary eyes of a lifelong soldier, led her into the inner sanctum, Juliet focused on the only armor she had: stillness. Leo's office was a study in calculated intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he owned, the light falling across a vast, empty desk of obsidian stone. He did not sit behind it. He stood at the window, a silhouette against the dying afternoon sun, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He was taller than she'd imagined, and his silence was a physical presence in the room. Marco announced her and melted away, the door clicking shut with a sound of terrible finality. For a full minute, Leo did not turn. He let the silence stretch, let her absorb the room's terrifying elegance, the original, violent Rothko painting on one wall, the shelves of first editions that spoke of a cultured, ruthless mind. When he finally moved, it was with a predator's languid grace. He turned, and his gaze was not what she expected. It wasn't angry. It was analytical, dissecting her from the tips of her paint-stained shoes to the anxious set of her shoulders. He took in the simple, worn elegance of her clothing, the intelligent defiance in her eyes that she couldn't quite smother, the careful way she held herself. "Your ledger is an eyesore, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that held no warmth. He did not gesture for her to sit. He began to circle her slowly, a shark assessing its prey. A trivial sum, in the grand scheme. Yet its existence suggests a disorder I do not tolerate in my city. Explain it. Juliet kept her voice level, rehearsing the practical excuses she'd prepared. The recession hit the arts sector hard. Major clients deferred projects. Insurance payments were slow. It was a perfect storm of bad timing, Mr. Valerius. "I have a payment plan." "I am not a bank," he interrupted, stopping his circuit directly in front of her. His proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of sandalwood and frost. "I am the final arbiter of what is permitted. Your perfect storm is a breach of contract with the entity that guarantees the safety of your business. That safety is not optional." He delivered a concise, devastating analysis of her finances, revealing a knowledge of her life that stole the breath from her lungs: her mother's illness, the mortgage on her studio, even the name of the specialist she was saving to see. It was a naked demonstration of power, meant to shatter her. Yet, as he spoke, his sharp eyes, which missed nothing, caught a flicker of movement at her wrist as she nervously adjusted her sleeve. The action revealed, for just a fraction of a second, the faint, telltale yellow and green edge of a fading bruise. Leo's monologue ceased abruptly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. His analytical gaze sharpened into something blade-like, singular, and intensely focused. The debt, the ledger, the entire financial pretext for her presence evaporated under the heat of this new, unexpected discovery. Something primal and possessive flickered in the depths of his cold eyes. A mark. On what he was already beginning to consider his property. He took a single, deliberate step closer, invading every last inch of her personal space. His voice, when it came again, was no longer the cool tone of a businessman. It was the absolute, glacial command of a king pronouncing a sentence. Sit down. He didn't shout. The command was all the more terrifying for its quiet control. He gestured to a severe leather armchair facing his desk. You're not leaving, he continued, each word dropping like a stone into the silent room, until you explain that Bruise. Juliet felt the world tilt. The carefully constructed wall of her composure cracked. This was not about money. This was something far more dangerous, far more personal. The man before her was no longer just a creditor, he was an inquisitor, and the subject of his inquisition had shifted from her finances to her very body. The gilded cage of his office suddenly felt as inescapable as a dungeon. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, then, with legs that threatened to buckle, she slowly lowered herself into the chair he had indicated. She was trapped, not by locks, but by the terrifying, inexplicable interest in the shadow on her skin. The real story, the one she had buried deep, was now the only currency that might buy her freedom, and she knew, with a sinking certainty, that Leo Valerius would extract every last word of it. The silence that followed Leo Valerius's command was not empty, it was a pressurized vessel, filling with the unspoken history of the Bruise and the terrifying weight of his attention. Juliet could feel his gaze on the skin of her wrist as if it were a physical touch, branding and inquisitorial. The panoramic cityscape behind him, once a symbol of distant freedom, now felt like a taunting diorama of a world from which she had just been severed. She pulled her sleeve down, a futile, instinctive gesture of concealment that only seemed to amplify the mark's significance. It's nothing, she said, the words sounding brittle even to her own ears. A clumsy accident. I was moving a large canvas in the studio, lost my balance. The corner of the stretcher caught me. Leo did not move. He stood before her, a statue of tailored wool and implicit violence, his expression unchanging. He let her lie hang in the air between them, allowing its flimsy construction to become apparent to them both. The corner of a canvas. A professional artist, adept at handling such materials, claiming an injury from a fundamental clumsiness. He didn't call her a liar. He simply deconstructed the lie with his stillness. You expect me, he began, his voice so low it was almost a whisper, yet it carried with terrifying clarity, to believe that a woman who runs a business, however currently insolvent, who navigates the complexities of pigment and preservation, is defeated by a piece of framed wood? He took one slow, deliberate step closer, then another, until he stood over her chair, blocking out the light from the window. Try again. Juliet's mind raced, a frantic animal seeking an exit that didn't exist. She could see the options narrowing, a better lie, the dangerous truth, or defiance. Defiance felt like the only armor she had left. She lifted her chin, meeting his glacial eyes. What does it matter? The Bruise has nothing to do with my debt to you. My body is my own business. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth might have been the ghost of a smile, had it not been utterly devoid of warmth. You are incorrect, he stated, as if correcting a factual error. From the moment you signed the contract for my protection, your well-being became a reflection on my organization. An unexplained injury is a vulnerability. A vulnerability is a point of entry for my enemies. Therefore, he concluded, his logic a cold, inescapable trap, it is my business. He finally moved, circling her chair like a satellite drawn into a doomed orbit. Let me propose a new arrangement, Miss Vance. The current one is unsatisfying. You owe me a significant sum. You also owe me an explanation you are clearly reluctant to give. I am prepared to address both. He stopped behind her, his voice coming from over her shoulder, intimate and threatening. Your existing debt will be frozen. Not forgiven. Frozen. It will gather no more interest, incur no more penalties. Furthermore, I am aware of the medical expenses concerning your mother. They will be taken care of. The best specialists, the best care. All debts to the hospital will be settled. Juliet's heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, stuttered. It was everything she needed, a miraculous reprieve from the relentless pressure that had been crushing her for months. It was also, she knew with absolute certainty, a deal with the devil. The price would be exquisite. And in return, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He came back into view, leaning against the front of his obsidian desk, folding his arms. The posture was deceptively casual. In return, you will take up residence here, in the secure apartments of this building. You will have a studio space provided. Your sole professional task will be to restore a painting of mine that was recently damaged. It is a family piece. It requires your specific expertise." He paused, letting the professional courtesy of the offer settle before he delivered the true condition. "And you will remain under my protection and my observation. Any new mark that appears on you, a scratch, a bruise, a burn, you will explain it. Immediately and truthfully. No more clumsy accidents." The audacity of it, the sheer, Gothic possessiveness of the terms, stole her breath. He wasn't just buying her debt, he was buying her. Her skill, her time, her physical autonomy. She would be a conservator in a gilded cage, her body a document he demanded to annotate. "You're proposing to make me a prisoner," she said, the shock giving way to a slow-burning anger. "I am proposing to make you safe," he countered, his eyes glinting. "The world out there," he gestured vaguely to the window, "has already left its mark on you once. I am eliminating that world. Here, within these walls, you will want for nothing. And you will be unmarked. Consider it a curatorial project. I am acquiring a damaged asset and investing in its restoration." The metaphor was chilling in its precision. He saw her as a piece of art, a violated object he intended to clean, repair, and keep under glass. The violation of her privacy was reframed as conservation. Her freedom was the price of her and her mother's security. "For how long?" she asked, clinging to the hope of a terminus. "Until the painting is restored to my satisfaction," he said, his gaze unwavering. "And until I am satisfied that the source of your carelessness has been permanently neutralized." It was an open-ended sentence. A life sentence. Juliet looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap to stop their trembling. She thought of her mother's tired face, of the stack of final notices on her studio desk, of the cold fear that had walked beside her for weeks. Then she thought of the man before her, a force of nature contained in a Seville Row suit, whose interest had become a terrifying form of ownership. He was offering a solution wrapped in chains. To refuse was to return to a drowning world with the shark still circling. To accept was to swim directly into its mouth. "The painting," she said finally, her voice hollow with surrender. "What is it?" A flicker of something, triumph, satisfaction, passed through his eyes. "A portrait. From the old country. It was defaced. I need it made whole again." He pushed off the desk and extended a hand, not to shake, but to summon. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Vance?" Juliet looked at his hand, then at the faint, yellowing bruise on her own wrist. The old wound for a new, unimaginable captivity. She did not take his hand. She simply nodded, the movement small and defeated. "We do." "Good," Leo said, withdrawing his hand, unsurprised by her refusal of the courtesy. He pressed a button on his desk. "Marco will see you to your new quarters. Your things will be fetched. Say your goodbyes to your old life, Juliet. You are now under my protection." As Marco entered, his expression unreadable, Juliet rose from the chair. She felt weightless and heavy all at once. She had just traded a mystery for a monster, and the terms of her new existence were clear. Her body was no longer her own. It was a canvas, and Leo Valerius had just declared himself its sole, possessive curator. The apartment was not a cell. It was, in every material sense, a masterpiece of contemporary luxury, a curated illusion of freedom that made the reality of her confinement all the more acute. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, dizzying view of the city's glittering spine, a constant reminder of the life below from which she had been severed. The air was silent, save for the almost imperceptible hum of climate control, scrubbing the space of any organic scent, leaving only the aroma of new leather, polished concrete, and money. It was a space designed by an architect who understood light, line, and the psychology of isolation. Every chair was a sculpture, every blanket a cashmere cloud, every book on the floating shelves a first edition carefully selected for its aesthetic or intellectual weight. It was, Juliet thought with a sinking heart, the most beautiful prison imaginable. Marco had deposited her there with the efficient dispatch of a concierge delivering luggage. "Your studio is through that door," he had said, gesturing to a seamless panel in the wall that slid open at a touch to reveal a northlit, pristine workspace. "Supplies will be provided based on your list. Meals will be delivered. Do not attempt to leave." The instructions were delivered without malice, which somehow made them worse. They were simply the rules of the ecosystem, as immutable as gravity. The main door had sealed behind him with a soft, definitive click. Not a lock she could pick, but a magnetic seal controlled from somewhere else, by someone else. The first 48 hours were a study in surreal dislocation. Juliet moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching nothing, feeling the oppressive weight of Leo's absence as keenly as if he were present. His taste was everywhere, a silent assertion of ownership. The art on the walls was bold, abstract, and vaguely violent, slashes of color that suggested conflict. The books were histories of war, treatises on power, volumes of poetry so dark they seemed to absorb the light. She was living inside his mind, and it was a cold, elegant, and intimidating place. Her own studio, by contrast, was a shock of sterile neutrality. It was better equipped than her old space had ever been: German easels, Italian magnifying lamps, a chemical fume hood, drawers waiting to be filled with pigments and mediums of impossible quality. On a central restoration easel, shrouded in a black cloth, was the painting. She left it covered. To uncover it felt like submitting to the core of his bargain, and she needed to preserve, for a little while longer, the fiction that she had a choice. Her defiance found its outlet in small, quiet rebellions. She rearranged the furniture in the living area by a few inches, disrupting the perfect feng shui. She left a book face down on a sofa, a deliberate act of casual disrespect towards a precious object. She used the extravagant espresso machine to make a single cup and left the grounds in the portafilter. These were messages in a bottle, tossed into the silent sea of the apartment, hoping to provoke a response, to prove she could still create a ripple. The response came on the third evening. She was standing at the window, watching the dusk bleed into the city's electric twilight, when the seal on the door hissed open. She didn't need to turn. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The air grew denser, charged with a predatory calm. Leo Valerius entered his domain as if he owned the very molecules of oxygen within it, which, she supposed, he effectively did. "Have you begun?" His voice cut through the quiet. He had discarded his suit jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and traced with the faint, pale lines of old, violent stories. Juliet kept her gaze on the window. "I've been acclimating the space. Assessing the light." "A generous interpretation of procrastination," he replied. She heard him move, not towards her, but to the kitchen island where she'd left a teacup. She'd used one of his delicate bone china cups, a small, defiant appropriation. He picked it up, examined it, and set it down without comment. "The painting is not getting any younger. Nor is our arrangement." This finally made her turn. "Our arrangement? You mean my indefinite house arrest?" He leaned against the island, a picture of controlled power. "House arrest implies you have committed a crime. This is a sanctuary. I've removed every stressor from your life. Debt, medical bills, security concerns. Your mind should be clear for your work." "My mind is crowded with the man who put me here," she shot back, the anger she'd been nursing finding a target. A flicker of something, interest, perhaps, lit his eyes. Good. Anger was better than fear. Anger was a dialogue. "And yet, here you stand, unharmed. Well-fed. In a space safer than any you've ever occupied. Your bruise is fading." He said it as if he'd personally commanded her cells to heal. "My methods are effective." "Your methods are tyranny," she said, but the heat was leaching from her words, diluted by the undeniable physical truth of her safety. He pushed off the island and began a slow circuit of the room, noting her small disruptions. He stopped by the deliberately misplaced armchair. With a single, effortless motion, he slid it back to its original, perfect position. It was not an angry correction. It was a demonstration, a reminder that her rebellions were permitted only because he chose to allow them. He was the curator, adjusting the display. "Tyranny is a failure of imagination," he said, his back to her as he straightened a book she had disordered. "This is a transaction. You provide a service and transparency. I provide a world without the chaos that left its mark on you. You may not like the walls, Juliet, but they are the only reason you are no longer prey." He turned then, and his gaze was no longer on the room but squarely on her, penetrating and analytical. "You have not looked at the painting." "Why?" The sudden shift disarmed her. "I told you. I was acclimating." "You are afraid," he stated, walking towards her studio door. The panel slid open at his approach. "You are afraid that once you begin the work, you become what I say you are, my restorer. And that fear is more powerful than your curiosity about the piece, which, given your profession, must be considerable. That is a fascinating conflict." He walked into the studio, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed. He went straight to the shrouded easel and, without ceremony, pulled away the black cloth. The portrait was not what she expected. It was not a stern patriarch or a glamorous dame. It was a painting of a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, seated in a formal chair too large for him. He was dressed in old-fashioned finery, but the background was a masterpiece of chiaroscuro, deep, rich shadows threatening to swallow the subject whole. And across the face, a savage, deliberate slash of a blade had rent the canvas, cutting through the boy's solemn expression. The violence of the act was shocking, a personal, intimate violation that echoed in the silent room. "My grandfather," Leo said, his voice devoid of any sentimental softness. "Painted shortly before his family's rivals murdered his parents. The slash was their calling card. A message that they could reach what he loved, even in memory." Juliet stared at the wound in the canvas. It was a history of violence made manifest. "You want me to fix this? I want you to make the damage disappear. I want it to be as if the violation never occurred." He turned his head to look at her, his profile sharp against the damaged face of the boy. "Can you do that?" It was a restoration challenge of the highest order. It was also a metaphor she could not escape. He was asking her to perform on canvas the very erasure he was attempting to perform on her, to clean, to repair, to make whole, to hide the evidence of past hurt. Her professional instinct warred with her personal revolt. The painting called to her skills, a siren song of a profound technical and artistic puzzle. To refuse was petty. To accept felt like complicity. "The materials," she said finally, her eyes tracing the jagged tear. "I'll need a specific list. The pigments are historical. The canvas weave is unusual." A slow nod. The first sign of approval. "Give the list to Marco. You will have whatever you require." He paused, his gaze moving from the slashed face of the boy to the fading yellow on her wrist, then back to her eyes. "We all have our damage, Juliet. The question is whether we have the skill, and the will, to face it. You may begin tomorrow." He replaced the cloth with a surprising gentleness, shrouding the painful history once more. As he walked past her to leave, he stopped at the threshold. "And move the chair back," he said, without looking at her. "The asymmetry is irritating." He left, and the door sealed. Juliet stood alone in the studio, the ghost of the slashed boy hanging between her and the world. The lines were drawn, not on the floor, but in the very fabric of their interaction. He was the force that ordered the universe, and she was the reluctant artisan hired to mend its torn pieces, all while living inside the largest tear of all. The gilded cage had just revealed its true purpose, it was a workshop. And her first task was to restore a mirror of his own past, under the cold, watchful eye of its living air. The rhythm of captivity established itself with a quiet, insidious regularity. Mornings began with the soft hiss of the door seal as a silent attendant left a tray of breakfast, exquisite fruits, artisanal breads, coffee that was a minor miracle, on the console in the foyer. There were no direct interactions with the staff, they were ghosts who serviced the habitat, maintaining the illusion that the penthouse was a self-sustaining ecosystem. Juliet's world had narrowed to 2 rooms, the pristine, logical space of the restoration studio, and the beautiful, empty expanse of the living quarters. The painting of the boy, now uncovered, became her silent companion. Its damaged face was a history she was tasked with erasing, stitch by meticulous stitch, and its solemn eyes seemed to watch her with an ancient, knowing patience. Her work was a sanctuary of a different kind. Within the precise disciplines of solvent application, lining, and in painting, she could momentarily forget the larger cage. The challenge of the portrait consumed her professional focus. She found herself speaking softly to it as she worked, a habit from her old studio, murmuring about pigment densities and the behavior of aged varnish. It was during these hours that she felt most like herself, the version of herself that existed before debts and threats and the chilling gaze of Leo Valerius. Yet, even this was tainted. Every brushstroke towards repair felt like a step deeper into his world, an act of service to his family's haunted legacy. She was using her talent to cleanse a symbol of his trauma, which in some dark, transactional way, he seemed to believe entitled him to cleanse hers. Leo himself was an inconsistent presence. He did not visit daily, but his absence was a palpable thing, a tension in the air. She would find subtle evidence of his nocturnal intrusions, a book she'd left on the armrest moved to the side table, the temperature of the rooms adjusted by a single degree, the espresso machine spotless after she'd deliberately left it soiled. He was auditing her existence, correcting her small rebellions with the quiet assurance of a landlord maintaining his property. When he did appear, it was always unannounced, the door sliding open to admit him as if the architecture itself recognized its master. Their interactions were verbal sparring matches, a strange, combative dance. He would critique her progress on the painting with a keen, surprisingly knowledgeable eye, questioning her choice of filler or her approach to color matching. She, in turn, would challenge his interpretations of art history, his taste in music that sometimes played softly through hidden speakers, his very philosophy of control. He seemed to relish these debates, his cold eyes lighting with a feral interest when she landed a logical point. It was a perverse form of companionship, the only stimulation in her curated world. The nightmare broke the fragile routine. It was not a vague, formless terror, but a specific, visceral reel from her past, the smell of turpentine and cheap cologne, the crushing weight of a body against a storage rack, the sharp, shocking pain of impact, and the low, threatening voice of the man from Dante Moretti's organization who had come to collect a different debt from her former employer and had found her alone instead. She woke not with a gasp, but with a choked scream that tore through the silent apartment, her body rigid, the phantom ache of the old bruise throbbing on her wrist. She was still trapped in the echo of the dream, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, when the lights in the bedroom bloomed to a soft, low level. He was there, framed in the doorway. He wore a dark robe over what looked like sleep pants, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been in his own bed somewhere in the vast building. He didn't speak. He simply crossed the room, his movements unhurried, and sat on the edge of her bed, a solid, immovable presence in the dark. Juliet flinched, pulling the duvet around her, shame and terror warring within her. This was the ultimate vulnerability, the private horror laid bare before her captor. "Was it the man who gave you the bruise?" Leo asked. His voice was not the courtroom baritone of his office, nor the debating tone of their sessions. It was low, almost rough with sleep, yet no less intense. She couldn't lie. The dream was too fresh on her skin. She gave a tight, single nod, her face turned into the pillow. A slow nod. The first sign of approval. "Give the list to Marco. You will have whatever you require." He paused, his gaze moving from the slashed face of the boy to the fading yellow on her wrist, then back to her eyes. "We all have our damage, Juliet. The question is whether we have the skill, and the will, to face it. You may begin tomorrow." He replaced the cloth with a surprising gentleness, shrouding the painful history once more. As he walked past her to leave, he stopped at the threshold. "And move the chair back," he said, without looking at her. "The asymmetry is irritating." He left, and the door sealed. Juliet stood alone in the studio, the ghost of the slashed boy hanging between her and the world. The lines were drawn, not on the floor, but in the very fabric of their interaction. He was the force that ordered the universe, and she was the reluctant artisan hired to mend its torn pieces, all while living inside the largest tear of all. The gilded cage had just revealed its true purpose, it was a workshop. And her first task was to restore a mirror of his own past, under the cold, watchful eye of its living heir. The rhythm of captivity established itself with a quiet, insidious regularity. Mornings began with the soft hiss of the door seal as a silent attendant left a tray of breakfast, exquisite fruits, artisanal breads, coffee that was a minor miracle, on the console in the foyer. There were no direct interactions with the staff, they were ghosts who serviced the habitat, maintaining the illusion that the penthouse was a self-sustaining ecosystem. Juliet's world had narrowed to 2 rooms, the pristine, logical space of the restoration studio, and the beautiful, empty expanse of the living quarters. The painting of the boy, now uncovered, became her silent companion. Its damaged face was a history she was tasked with erasing, stitch by meticulous stitch, and its solemn eyes seemed to watch her with an ancient, knowing patience. Her work was a sanctuary of a different kind. Within the precise disciplines of solvent application, lining, and in painting, she could momentarily forget the larger cage. The challenge of the portrait consumed her professional focus. She found herself speaking softly to it as she worked, a habit from her old studio, murmuring about pigment densities and the behavior of aged varnish. It was during these hours that she felt most like herself, the version of herself that existed before debts and threats and the chilling gaze of Leo Valerius. Yet, even this was tainted. Every brushstroke towards repair felt like a step deeper into his world, an act of service to his family's haunted legacy. She was using her talent to cleanse a symbol of his trauma, which in some dark, transactional way, he seemed to believe entitled him to cleanse hers. Leo himself was an inconsistent presence. He did not visit daily, but his absence was a palpable thing, a tension in the air. She would find subtle evidence of his nocturnal intrusions, a book she'd left on the armrest moved to the side table, the temperature of the rooms adjusted by a single degree, the espresso machine spotless after she'd deliberately left it soiled. He was auditing her existence, correcting her small rebellions with the quiet assurance of a landlord maintaining his property. When he did appear, it was always unannounced, the door sliding open to admit him as if the architecture itself recognized its master. Their interactions were verbal sparring matches, a strange, combative dance. He would critique her progress on the painting with a keen, surprisingly knowledgeable eye, questioning her choice of filler or her approach to color matching. She, in turn, would challenge his interpretations of art history, his taste in music that sometimes played softly through hidden speakers, his very philosophy of control. He seemed to relish these debates, his cold eyes lighting with a feral interest when she landed a logical point. It was a perverse form of companionship, the only stimulation in her curated world. The nightmare broke the fragile routine. It was not a vague, formless terror, but a specific, visceral reel from her past, the smell of turpentine and cheap cologne, the crushing weight of a body against a storage rack, the sharp, shocking pain of impact, and the low, threatening voice of the man from Dante Moretti's organization who had come to collect a different debt from her former employer and had found her alone instead. She woke not with a gasp, but with a choked scream that tore through the silent apartment, her body rigid, the phantom ache of the old bruise throbbing on her wrist. She was still trapped in the echo of the dream, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, when the lights in the bedroom bloomed to a soft, low level. He was there, framed in the doorway. He wore a dark robe over what looked like sleep pants, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been in his own bed somewhere in the vast building. He didn't speak. He simply crossed the room, his movements unhurried, and sat on the edge of her bed, a solid, immovable presence in the dark. Juliet flinched, pulling the duvet around her, shame and terror warring within her. This was the ultimate vulnerability, the private horror laid bare before her captor. "Was it the man who gave you the bruise?" Leo asked. His voice was not the courtroom baritone of his office, nor the debating tone of their sessions. It was low, almost rough with sleep, yet no less intense. She couldn't lie. The dream was too fresh on her skin. She gave a tight, single nod, her face turned into the pillow. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer empty comfort. He just sat there, a silent sentinel in the dim light. "Tell me his name," he said, the command soft but absolute. The words spilled out of her, fractured by residual panic. "I don't. I only heard a first name. Victor. He worked for Moretti. He was there for my old boss, but I was alone, finishing a varnish layer. He thought I was hiding something. He wanted," she trailed off, the memory of his hands on her arms, the shove into the steel frame of a storage shelf, the laugh as she'd crumpled. Leo absorbed this in silence. The only sign of reaction was a slight tightening of his jaw, a minute flex of the muscle in his forearm where it rested on his thigh. "Did he do anything else?" "No," she whispered. "Just the threat. Just the demonstration." A long, quiet exhalation. "Good." The word was chilling in its simplicity. It wasn't sympathy, it was an assessment of damage, a cataloging. He was satisfied the violation had not been greater. They sat in the strange, shared silence for what felt like an hour but was likely only minutes. The awful panic began to recede, replaced by a profound exhaustion and a disorienting sense of safety. His presence, which should have felt like the greatest threat, was paradoxically anchoring. He was the monster at the door, and for tonight, that meant no other monsters could get in. Eventually, her breathing evened, and the violent tension left her limbs. Leo rose from the bed as silently as he had come. He paused at the door, looking back at her. "The painting," he said, as if continuing a different conversation entirely. "You've made excellent progress on the boy's waistcoat. The texture of the brocade is convincing." Then he was gone, the lights dimming back to darkness, the seal on her door sighing shut. The next morning, the routine was different. The breakfast tray was there, but beside it, on the console, was a small, unmarked tin of loose-leaf tea. Juliet picked it up, the scent wafting through the perforated lid, a rare, smoky lapsang souchong. It was the tea she had mentioned only once, in passing, days before during one of their debates, complaining about the blandness of the provided herbal selections. She'd said, almost to herself, what I wouldn't give for a proper pot of lapsang. He had remembered. He had provided it. Not as a gift, but as a statement. Sitting at the counter with a steaming cup of the pungent, familiar tea, Juliet felt the walls of her gilded cage reconfigure. They were no less solid, no less real. But the man who held the key was no longer just a distant tyrant. He was a watchful, terrifyingly attentive shadow who had seen her broken in the night and had not used it as a weapon. He had instead offered a silent vigil and then, in the daylight, demonstrated the unsettling scope of his attention with a tin of tea. It was a form of care, she supposed, but it was care as a byproduct of possession. He was tending to his asset. The nightmare had cracked the pristine surface of their arrangement, and through that crack had seeped a new, more dangerous intimacy. He had seen her fear, and he had not scorned it. He had merely filed it away, along with the name Victor, and in doing so, had woven himself deeper into the fabric of her reality. The bruise on her wrist was fading, but Leo Valerius was imprinting himself in its place, not with violence, but with a silence that was infinitely more binding. The tea was the first breach in the wall, but the gallery opening was the full-scale invasion. Leo's command, delivered by Marco that morning, was not an invitation. "You will accompany Mr. Valerius to the Vanguard Gallery tonight at 8. Attire will be provided." It was a mission parameter. The attire arrived in a black garment bag, a floor-length sheath dressed the color of crushed midnight, severe in its lines, breathtaking in its expense. It felt less like clothing and more like a uniform, armor for a battle she hadn't agreed to fight. As she dressed, Juliet felt a perverse sense of being curated once more, selected and presented as part of his collection. Leo arrived precisely at 8, a study in monochromatic power in a tuxedo that seemed woven from shadow itself. His eyes swept over her, a swift, appraising glance that missed no detail. He gave a single, slight nod of approval, a general satisfied with his soldier's turnout. "You look appropriate," he said, the compliment as cold and precise as a scalpel. He extended his arm, not for her to take, but as a placeholder for her hand. The gesture was futile. She had no choice but to rest her fingers lightly on the dark wool, feeling the unyielding muscle beneath. The Vanguard Gallery was a cathedral of contemporary wealth, all polished concrete, soaring glass, and the low, reverent hum of money appreciating art. Leo's entrance caused a ripple, a subtle parting of the sea of chic attendees. He was known here, respected and feared in equal measure. Juliet, on his arm, felt the weight of 100 speculative glances. Who was she? A new acquisition? A mistress? A business interest? She was a mystery hanging from the arm of the city's greatest enigma, and the attention was a new kind of confinement. Leo played his part flawlessly. He introduced her as Juliet Vance, a distinguished restorer, his voice granting her a professional legitimacy that felt like another layer of the gilded cage. He discussed the artwork on display with collectors and critics, his insights sharp, his patronage evident. He was showcasing her, yes, but he was also showcasing his own power to possess and display such a rarity. She was living proof of his reach, of his ability to pluck an obscure talent from obscurity and install her in his world. The forced proximity, his hand occasionally settling at the small of her back to guide her, sent confusing signals through her system, a threat, a claim, a performance. It was during a moment when Leo was drawn into a deeper conversation about baselets with a Swiss banker that the atmosphere shifted. A man materialized at her elbow, his presence accompanied by a cloud of expensive sandalwood and a smile that held too many teeth. "A restoration expert," the man said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "How fascinating. One so rarely meets someone who deals in resurrection." He was handsome in a way that felt deliberate, every feature perfectly arranged for charm. But his eyes, a warm brown, held a calculation that chilled her. Dante Moretti. An admirer of the arts in all their forms. The name was a spike of ice in her spine. Moretti. The source of Victor. The rival. She felt the ghost of the bruise ache on her wrist. Juliet Vance, she managed, her voice steady only through a tremendous effort of will. Oh, I know, Dante said, his smile widening. He leaned in, a conspiratorial gesture that felt obscenely intimate. I make it a point to know the people Leo finds interesting. Especially when they have history with my organization. A small misunderstanding, I assure you. Victor was always overzealous. He knew. He knew about the bruise, about the incident. He was not just making conversation, he was asserting knowledge, establishing a connection that existed outside of Leo's control. It was a power play, and she was the chessboard. It was no misunderstanding, she said, finding a sliver of steel. Of course not, Dante conceded, his gaze dropping to her wrist before flicking back to her face. A regrettable lapse. I'd hoped to apologize personally. Perhaps, over a private dinner? I have a Cellini cup I've been longing to have authenticated. I hear your eye is unparalleled. The invitation was a grenade, lobbed casually into the center of Leo's territory. Before she could formulate a response, the air around her changed, grew dense and cold. Leo had finished his conversation. He was beside her in 2 strides, his presence an eclipse that blotted out Dante's practiced charm. Moretti, Leo said. The single word was a dismissal of his entire person. Valerius, Dante replied, his smile never faltering. I was just complimenting you on your newest treasure. Such a specific skill set. One wonders where you find them. The silent war between them crackled in the air. Leo's hand came up, not to shake Dante's, but to encircle Juliet's upper arm. His grip was not guiding this time, it was possessive, territorial, a brand of ownership. It was also, she realized with a jolt, painfully tight. His fingers dug into the exact muscle, a warning and a claiming all in one. She is not for your curiosity, Leo stated, his voice low and final. Excuse us. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned, pulling Juliet with him, his stride long and furious as he cut a path through the crowd towards the exit. The art, the people, the music, it all blurred into a smear of color and noise. She had to half-jog to keep up, his grip a vice on her arm, a counterpoint to the phantom pain from Victor's grip months before. He didn't speak until they were in the soundproofed back seat of the waiting town car, the partition already up. What did he say to you? Leo's voice was a whipcrack in the dim cabin. He knew about the bruise. He mentioned Victor by name. He invited me to dinner, she reported, the words tumbling out, her own anger beginning to rise to meet his. He was trying to get under your skin. And he succeeded, Leo snarled, the controlled facade shattered. In the passing streetlights, his face was a mask of pure, primal fury. Not at Dante, she realized, but at the entire situation, at the reminder of a vulnerability he hadn't created but now felt responsible for. His gaze dropped to his own hand, still clenched around her arm. In the intermittent light, she could already see the faint, red imprints of his fingers on her pale skin. Fresh bruises, blooming in real time. The hypocrisy of it was a lightning bolt. It shattered the strange, tense peace of the past weeks. The man who had demanded an explanation for every mark, who had made her physical integrity the cornerstone of their arrangement, was the one currently leaving his own violent signature on her. The car pulled into the underground sanctum of his tower. The moment the door closed on the private elevator soaring up to the penthouse, she wrenched her arm from his grasp. The pain was sharp, clarifying. Explain that bruise, she said, her voice shaking not with fear, but with a furious, betrayed heat. She thrust her arm toward him, the red marks vivid against her skin in the elevator's cool light. Leo stared at the marks, his chest rising and falling with a breath he seemed to be forcing down. The fury in his eyes flickered, confronted by the physical evidence of his own loss of control. He was touching you, Leo said, the justification sounding hollow even to him. He was talking to me, she shot back, the dam breaking. You, who interrogated me for hours over a faded yellow mark, you who promised a sanctuary from carelessness, you just did the exact same thing. You're no better than Victor. You're just a richer, more powerful version of the same violent man. The words hung in the enclosed space, brutal and absolute. She had thrown his own philosophy back in his face, and for a moment, he was utterly still. The accusation, you're no better, seemed to penetrate the armor of his rage. He looked from the marks on her arm to her face, her eyes blazing with a truth he couldn't refute. The elevator doors opened into the silent penthouse, but neither of them moved. The gilded cage now held a new, volatile element, her righteous anger, and his terrifying, hypocritical shame. The night had begun with her as a displayed trophy and ended with the fundamental terms of her captivity exposed as a lie. The protector had become, in one blinding moment, the aggressor. And in the stark, unforgiving silence of their return, the balance of power between jailer and prisoner quivered on a knife's edge. The silence in the penthouse was a physical entity, thick and suffocating, born of Juliet's damning accusation and the raw, livid marks on her skin. The elevator doors had shut behind them, sealing them into the arena of his own making. Leo did not move towards the living room, towards the bar, towards any of the usual props of his dominion. He stood frozen, his gaze locked on her arm as if the imprints of his own fingers were a foreign language he was struggling to decipher. The fury that had sculpted his features in the car was still there, but it had cooled into something harder, more dangerous, a focused, ice-cold rage directed inward. "You will not," he began, his voice dangerously quiet, "compare me to that animal." "The evidence disagrees," Juliet fired back, though the bravado was leaching away, replaced by a thrumming awareness of the risk she'd taken. She cradled her arm, the ache a steady pulse. "You made my body a condition of this arrangement. No new marks without explanation. So explain it, Leo. What is this?" He flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the use of his first name. It was a weapon she hadn't employed before, a move from prisoner to equal accuser. It shattered the remaining facade of their professional detachment. He turned away from her, striding to the wall of windows, his back a rigid line of tension against the city's indifferent glitter. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared out as if seeking an answer in the grid of lights. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual calculated cadence, raw with a frustration that seemed to surprise even him. "You think this is about control," he said, not to her, but to the glass. "A simple matter of dominion. It is not." He turned then, and his eyes were no longer just cold, they were haunted by a possessiveness so absolute it bordered on madness. "That mark he left on you, it was a flaw in my perimeter. A failure. I did not know you then. But I know you now. And seeing him touch you, speak to you, knowing what he allowed to happen to you, it wasn't about him touching you. It was about him touching what is mine." The word hung in the air, archaic and terrifying. Mine. It wasn't a romantic claim, it was a declaration of property, more profound and unsettling than any contract. He had moved from curator to collector, and the collection was now personal. "So you mark me yourself?" Juliet's voice was a whisper, the fight gone out of it, replaced by a dawning, horrific understanding. No, the denial was swift, sharp. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, as if fearing his own touch. "That was a lapse. An instinct I did not govern. You are correct. It makes me a hypocrite." The admission seemed to cost him something, grinding out from between his teeth. "But it does not make me him. He married you for sport, for pressure, for a petty debt. I would burn his world to the ground for the one he already left." The sheer, quiet conviction in his voice was more frightening than any shout. This was not hyperbole. It was a strategic objective. Juliet's mind, reeling from the emotional whiplash of the evening, latched onto the one concrete thing in the storm. A name. "Victor," she said. His name was Victor. He worked out of a pawn shop on the North End. Fortune's favors. He had a serpent tattoo coiling around his left thumb. The information spilled out of her, the details she had suppressed, the identifiers she had noted in her moment of terror and filed away as a survival instinct. She hadn't even realized she remembered the tattoo so clearly. Leo's entire being stilled. The raw emotion on his face solidified into something else, a pure, crystalline purpose. The shift was instantaneous and chilling. The man grappling with his own hypocrisy vanished, replaced by the undisputed sovereign of a violent kingdom. He gave a single, slow nod, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you," he said, the words chilling in their formality. The gratitude was not for her trust, but for intelligence delivered. He turned and walked to the hidden panel that led to his private study, a room she had never entered. He placed his hand on a scanner, and the door whispered open, revealing a glimpse of a stark, technological space within. He paused on the threshold, looking back at her. The anger was gone, replaced by an unnerving calm. "The marks on your arm," he said, his tone now that of a commander issuing a briefing. "Apply ice. They will fade by morning. They will not be repeated." It was both an apology and a new edict. "What happens next is not about you. It is about territorial integrity. Dante made a move within my borders. He will be reminded of the consequences." The door shut behind him with a soft, definitive click, leaving her alone in the vast, silent living room. The confrontation was over, but it had mutated into something else. Her accusation had not broken their arrangement, it had forged it in a stranger, darker fire. She had handed him a name, and in doing so, she had become more than a captive or a restorer. She had become an informant. A catalyst. She walked to the kitchen, filled a cloth with ice, and pressed it to her throbbing arm. The cold was a shock, a sensory anchor. She replayed the night, Dante's smirking provocation, Leo's violent reaction, her own defiant strike, and finally, his transformation from possessive, conflicted man to cold-blooded strategist. He had taken her pain, her memory, and weaponized it. The original Bruise, the source of all of this, was no longer just a personal violation. It was a casus belli. The penthouse felt different. It was no longer just a cage or a workshop. It had become the quiet eye of a coming storm. She had wanted a reaction from her small rebellions, the misplaced book, the messy espresso machine. She had gotten one far beyond her imagination. She had provoked not just a correction of furniture, but the unleashing of a force of nature. Leo was not going to soothe her bruised arm with words or tea. He was going to scour the earth of the man who had caused the first one, and in the process, ignite a war with his rival. Her safety, she understood now, was never going to be found in the absence of violence. It was to be forged in the midst of it, guaranteed by the retaliatory fury of the man who now considered her his most prized, and most provocatively acquired, possession. The hypocrisy of his touch still burned on her skin, but it was now overlaid with a more terrifying truth. In his own twisted, brutal logic, he was keeping his promise. He was eliminating the chaos that had marked her. He was just doing it with a chaos of his own making, and she, by handing him Victor's name, had just loaded the first gun. The days that followed the gallery were characterized by a new and eerie quiet, a lull that felt not like peace, but like the held breath before an explosion. Leo was absent, physically and atmospherically. The penthouse, usually so imbued with his imposing essence, became a sterile vacuum. Marco appeared once daily with supplies for the painting, a specific rabbitskin glue, a batch of meticulously ground ochre, but his exchanges were terse, his eyes avoiding hers, as if she were a piece of delicate ordnance that might detonate. The world outside the tower, as reported in the financial news on the silent television and the society columns she browsed on the tablet he'd provided, continued its glittering spin, oblivious to the tectonic shifts occurring in its underworld. Juliet threw herself into the restoration with a fervor that bordered on obsession. The portrait of the young boy became her entire universe. Under her careful hands, the savage slash across his face began to close. She worked with a microscopic focus, lining the torn canvas fibers, building up layers of filler, mixing pigments with a chemist's precision to match the centuries-old oils. It was more than just technical mastery, it was an exorcism. Each delicate stroke that smoothed the violence felt like an attempt to impose order on the chaos she had unleashed by speaking Victor's name. She was repairing Leo's past while he, presumably, was violently reshaping her present. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth, a constant companion to the smell of linseed oil and solvent. He returned on the fourth night. There was no announcement, no sound of the door. She simply felt the change in the air, a drop in pressure, and looked up from her workbench to find him leaning against the studio doorway, watching her. He looked older, wearier, the lines around his eyes etched a little deeper, but there was a profound, unsettling calm about him. The turbulent conflict from their last encounter was gone, burned away. In its place was a resolved intensity that was somehow more formidable. "It's progressing," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He didn't approach the easel, his gaze fixed on her, not her work. Juliet set down her brush, her heart thudding against her ribs. She didn't ask about Victor. She didn't need to. The answer was in the absolute finality of his demeanor. The deed was done. A life, extinguished as a corrective measure, a line item in the ledger of her protection. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, she felt a treacherous, shameful sense of relief, a primal satisfaction that the source of her fear was gone. This realization sickened her almost as much as the act itself. It's a fascinating process, Leo continued, pushing off the doorframe and walking slowly into the room. He didn't look at the boy's face, he watched her hands. The eradication of damage. It requires patience. A steady hand. A vision of what was, and what should be again. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell the cold night air and a faint, acrid scent on his clothes that might have been gunpowder or just the city's grime. You have those qualities in abundance. It's just technique, she replied, her voice tight. No, he said, shaking his head slowly. It's alchemy. You take broken history and make it appear whole. You grant the illusion of an untouched past. His eyes lifted from her hands to her face, searching. I find myself increasingly drawn to that illusion. He moved then, not towards the painting, but towards a small side table where a covered object sat. He drew back the cloth she'd thrown over it. Beneath was a small, exquisite marble sculpture, a fragment of a hand, ancient and smooth. A Hellenistic piece, he said, running a fingertip over the stone knuckles. Salvaged from a shipwreck. It spent centuries at the bottom of the sea, battered by currents, eroded by salt. Yet its beauty is undeniable, even enhanced by its scars. The violence of its history is part of its value now. He looked at her, and the metaphor was not subtle. He was drawing a parallel between the sculpture and herself. Between his possessive curation of damaged art and his possessive curation of her. I don't want my history to be part of my value, she whispered, the confession torn from her. But it is, he said, taking a final step that closed the distance between them. He didn't touch her. The space between their bodies hummed with a tension that had been building since the moment he demanded an explanation for her bruise. It's what brought you here. It's what makes you understand the portrait. It's what makes you, he trailed off, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes with a searing honesty. Unbreakable. I see the fear, and I see the thing that holds fast behind it. That is a rarity. I collect rarities. His admission was a key turning in a lock deep inside her. This was not about debt or protection or even simple lust. It was about recognition of a kind she had never experienced, a dark mirror held up to her own resilience. He saw the cracks, and instead of devaluing her, he prized them. It was a terrifying, seductive form of being seen. When he finally kissed her, it was not an assault, nor was it gentle. It was acclaiming, deliberate and absolute. It was the physical manifestation of his words, an acceptance of her history and a possession of her present. Juliet did not pull away. The part of her that had been fighting, the part that clung to the idea of the victim, dissolved in the heat of that kiss. She kissed him back with a fury that matched his own, a torrent of weeks of fear, anger, confusion, and that treacherous, unwelcome attraction. Her hands, stained with pigment, fisted in the fine wool of his jacket, not to push him away, but to anchor herself in the storm. It was not love. It was something darker, more elemental, a collision of two damaged, stubborn forces. It was passion forged in conflict, desire born of imprisonment, need twisted with power. He lifted her onto the edge of the workbench, vials of medium rattling, and the world narrowed to the feel of his hands on her skin, erasing the memory of all other hands, and the taste of him, a mix of winter and wrath. The portrait of the solemn boy witnessed it, his newly repaired face a silent judge over this new, chaotic union. In that moment, the roles of captor and captive, restorer and collector, blurred into irrelevance. There was only the desperate, brutal truth of their mutual obsession, consummated not in a bed, but in the studio, amidst the tools of repair and the ghosts of past violence. He was not making her whole. He was taking the broken pieces of the narrative that had brought them together and assembling them into a new, uncharted, and deeply compromised shape. The war with Dante was looming, but in the quiet of the penthouse, a different, more intimate surrender had just taken place. The physical union changed everything and nothing. The penthouse was no longer just a cage or a workshop, it was now a shared lair, charged with a new, volatile electricity. Leo's presence became a constant, no longer an unpredictable intrusion but the defining rhythm of her days. He would work through the night in his study, the faint glow of monitors under his door a blue pulse in the dark apartment, and emerge at dawn to find her already at her easel. They shared meals in a silence that was no longer hostile, but thick with the memory of touch. He would watch her work with an artist's eye, commenting on her technique, his knowledge of Renaissance methods a disquieting testament to the cultured mind that coexisted with the killer's instinct. The portrait of his grandfather was nearing completion, the slash now only a faint, ghostly texture under layers of masterful in-painting, a visible secret, a violation remembered but not seen. This fragile, private world was first breached by Elena. Juliet's best friend, with the tenacity of an investigative journalist and the protective fury of a sister, had not been placated by Juliet's brief, encrypted messages about a lucrative, live-in restoration job. Elena's digital footprint was a trail Leo's security had easily monitored, but her physical audacity was a surprise. She bypassed the tower's lobby security by tailgating a catering van into the delivery bay, used a borrowed staff keycard lifted from a distracted cleaner, and made it as far as the penthouse floor foyer before Marco's men intercepted her. The commotion, Elena's loud, righteous demands to see her friend, drifted through the sealed door, a jarring echo of a forgotten life. Leo, standing beside Juliet at the living room window, didn't turn at the sound. "The journalist," he stated, as if reading a report. "She believes she's staging a rescue." "She's my friend," Juliet said, her heart clenching. The sound of Elena's voice was a lifeline thrown from a sinking ship she had, in some dark part of herself, chosen to remain aboard. "She is a liability," he corrected, his tone analytical. "Her sentimentality could get her killed. More importantly, it could put you in the crossfire if Dante learns of her connection to you." He finally looked at her, his gaze inscrutable. "You may see her. Under supervision. For 10 minutes. Convince her you are not a victim." It was a test. Not of her loyalty to him, but of her acceptance of the new reality. Marco brought a furious, disheveled Elena into the living room, his hand a firm warning on her elbow. The contrast was painful, Elena in her practical jeans and sharp blazer, her eyes wide with alarm as she took in the chilling luxury of the prison, and Juliet in one of the simple, expensive linen dresses Leo provided, standing beside the man who owned the view, and by extension, her. "Juliet, what the hell is this?" Elena breathed, ignoring Leo completely. "This isn't a job, this is him. Valerius." She said his name like a curse. "It's complicated, Elena," Juliet began, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "Complicated? He's a crime lord. I've been digging, Jules. The debts, the disappearances, this man is poison." Her eyes darted to Leo, who observed the scene with the detached interest of a scientist. "Come with me right now. I have a car downstairs. We'll go to the police, we'll—" "The police," Leo interjected, his voice a soft, lethal purr, "are on my payroll. The car downstairs is mine. And your editor, Mr. Higgins, has a gambling debt to a bookie who answers to me. Sit down, Miss Rossi. You are shouting in my home." The casually delivered information silenced Elena. It was a masterful demonstration of power, not through shouted threats, but through the quiet revelation that her world was already permeated by his influence. He owned the very avenues of her escape. Juliet stepped forward, taking Elena's cold hands. "Listen to me. I am safe here. My mother is being cared for. My work is important. You need to stop digging. For your own sake." Elena searched her face, looking for signs of coercion, of fear. What she saw was more confusing, a weary resolve, a strange kind of peace, and a flicker of something that looked terrifyingly like possession when Juliet's eyes briefly met Leo's. "You're choosing this?" Elena whispered, horrified. The question hung in the air. Was it a choice? It had begun as a coercion, evolved into a transaction, and had now become a catastrophic entanglement. "I am choosing to stay," Juliet said, which was the closest thing to the truth she could manage. The meeting ended with Elena being escorted out, her face a mask of devastated comprehension. The door sealed, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. Juliet had chosen her cage, and in doing so, had broken a tie to the person who represented her old, free self. Leo came to stand behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders, a gesture of both comfort and ownership. "That was necessary," he said. Sentiment is a luxury that gets people killed in a war. The war he spoke of was no longer an abstraction. Dante Moretti, humiliated by the very public elimination of his enforcer Victor, a body had been found in a way that sent an unambiguous message, and enraged by Leo's gallery display of Juliet, had moved beyond provocations. He struck at Leo's financial architecture. A lucrative, semi-legitimate shipping venture was hit with a devastating customs blockade, orchestrated through Dante's political connections. Warehouses were raided, not by police, but by masked men who took nothing but meticulously destroyed inventory. It was economic sabotage, designed to bleed and weaken. Leo's response was swift and brutal, but targeted. He did not lash out blindly. He retaliated by dismantling Dante's prized underground casino network, using insider information to trigger police raids and financial seizures. The conflict was a chess game played with real lives and millions of dollars, a shadow war escalating in the city's veins. Juliet, insulated in her tower, was a spectator to this through terse phone conversations she overheard, through the increased grimness on Marco's face, through the longer hours Leo spent in his study, his brow furrowed under the glow of schematics and financial trails. She was the touchstone, the reason cited, but also removed from the fray, a queen held protectively, perilously, in the center of the board. Then, the board shattered. A simple, calculated errand. A specific, irreplaceable amber varnish she needed for the portrait's final glaze was out of stock with their usual supplier. A smaller, specialized art shop across town had it. Against Marco's vehement objections, Leo decreed she would go. She will be armored. She will have a full detail. It is 5 minutes in and out. Dante needs to understand she is not hidden away in fear. She moves under my shield. It was a show of strength. A fatal miscalculation. The armored town car was ambushed not with bullets, but with orchestrated chaos. A garbage truck broke down at an intersection, boxing them in. A van door slid open, and men with not guns, but canisters of smoke and blinding strobe lights, swarmed. Their objective was not assassination, that would invite apocalyptic retaliation. It was a snatch. A message. In the terrifying, disorienting fog, Juliet was ripped from the car. She fought, a wildcat fury born of weeks of suppressed terror, but a needle found her neck. The last thing she saw before the world dissolved into blackness was Marco, his face a mask of blood and rage, firing into the smoke, and the gleaming, triumphant eyes of one of Dante's men as she was hauled into the van. She awoke in a windowless room, not a dank cellar, but a bland, furnished safe house. Dante Moretti sat across from her, sipping espresso. "Juliet," he said, smiling. "Welcome. Don't be alarmed. You're my guest. A bargaining chip. Leo took something of mine. Now I have something of his. We'll see how much his new acquisition is really worth." The gilded cage was gone. She was now a raw, exposed pawn in the open war, and her value was about to be tested in the most brutal currency imaginable. The protector had been defied, and the protected was in the hands of the enemy. The illusion of safety, so carefully constructed in the penthouse, had vaporized in a cloud of tactical smoke. The war was no longer outside. It had reached in and taken her. The safe house was a study in psychological pressure. It was not a dungeon, it was a bland, mid-century modern apartment, tastefully furnished, its windows bricked over and painted white to mimic light. There was food, water, even books. Dante Moretti presented himself not as a thug, but as a businessman engaged in a hostile takeover. He visited her twice a day, his demeanor one of collegial regret. "This is just the ugly side of commerce, my dear," he'd sigh, pouring her a glass of water she never drank. Leo's always been emotionally invested in his assets. It clouds his judgment. We're simply clarifying the market. His words were meant to deconstruct the bond, to reframe Leo's obsession as a strategic weakness. He probed for details, not about Leo's operations, but about his habits with her, his routines in the penthouse, the small, human vulnerabilities. Does he sleep soundly? Does he like his coffee black? These are the tells of a man's state of mind, Dante explained, as if tutoring her in a dark art. Juliet answered in monosyllables or silence. Her fear was a cold, hard stone in her gut, but beneath it, simmering with a heat that surprised her, was a fury so pure it felt like clarity. Fury at Dante, at the men who held her, and, irrationally, at Leo for letting this happen, for making her a target in his display of power. Meanwhile, the city trembled. Dante's move was a masterstroke of underworld theater. He didn't hide his acquisition. He leaked it, a blurry photo of Juliet, disoriented but unharmed, sitting in the safe-house chair, delivered to Leo through a neutral channel. The message was clear, *I have what you value. The rules have changed. The demand was not for money or territory, but for something more symbolic, a public, humiliating withdrawal from their shared ventures, a signed concession of defeat. It was a checkmate move, designed to break Leo's prestige, the very foundation of his power. For Leo Valerius, the world narrowed to a single, burning point. The cold strategist vanished, replaced by something primal and terrifying. Marco, his face stitched from the ambush, found his boss not in the war room studying blueprints, but in Juliet's studio, standing before the nearly restored portrait. Leo's hand rested on the boy's now whole face, his touch frighteningly gentle. "We have traced the van to a holding company," Marco reported, his voice gravelly. "It's a shell within a shell. It will take time. We may not have to find the location. He's waiting for your public response." Leo didn't turn. "He wants a performance," he said, his voice hollow, stripped of all its calculated layers. "He wants me to kneel. The alternative is a full-scale assault on all Moretti's known properties. It will be a bloodbath. We may not reach her in time, and the fallout will destroy our holdings for a generation. There is no alternative that does not end with her dead," Leo stated, the simple truth chilling the air. "If I kneel, he kills her to finalize my humiliation. If I attack, he kills her out of spite. He has designed a game with no winning move." He finally turned from the portrait. His eyes were the eyes of a man staring into an abyss, and the abyss was a world without the impossible, infuriating, essential woman he had locked away for her own safety. The grand irony of it threatened to unhinge him. All his power, his control, his violent dominion, had been insufficient. His cage had not been strong enough. His obsession had painted the target himself. It was in this state of desolate calculation that he made his decision. He summoned Marco and gave 2 sets of orders. The first was a series of precise, ruthless commands involving hackers, bribes, and the mobilization of every sleeper agent embedded near Moretti's operations. It was not a blunt force attack, but a surgical strike aimed at the infrastructure of the kidnapping itself, the money flows, the communication relays, the weak links in the chain of men who knew where she was. The second order was personal. He had Juliet's personal effects from her old studio brought to him. He spent hours in her restored space, surrounded by her half-finished canvases, her sketchbooks filled with margins, notes, and quick studies. He wasn't looking for clues, he was reconstructing her mind. He found the answer not in her art, but in her margins. Scribbled notes on forgery techniques, observations on the chemical composition of historical pigments to spot fakes, a musing on how a master's brushstroke could be deconstructed into a series of reproducible pressures. Juliet Vance was a restorer, but her mind worked like a brilliant, analytical counterfeiter. A plan, desperate and brilliant, crystallized. It required a sacrifice he had never before contemplated. He requested a face-to-face meeting with Dante, under a flag of truce in a neutral location, a private dining room at the Metropolis Club. Dante arrived, smug and expansive, expecting a surrender speech. Leo stood alone by the fireplace, no guards in sight. "You've caused a lot of trouble for a painting fixer, Leo," Dante opened, pouring himself a drink from the sidebar. "She is more than that," Leo said, his voice flat. "And you know it. Name your price. Not the public spectacle. Something real. The downtown docks. The casino licenses. All of it. For her, returned unharmed, tonight." Dante's eyebrows rose. The offer was staggering, a generational fortune. It was also a trap. To accept would be to believe Leo Valerius would willingly dismantle his empire, making himself a vulnerable, wealthy target. It was too much, therefore it was a lie. "You expect me to believe you'd trade your kingdom for one woman?" Dante laughed. "Sentiment is a cancer, my friend. It makes you weak. It makes you make poor offers." Leo's mask of negotiation slipped for a single, revealing instant. Raw, unchecked agony flashed across his features. It was the performance of a lifetime, born of a genuine terror he had never felt before. "She is the kingdom," he growled, the words torn from him. It was the perfect, believable lie. Dante saw it, the great Leo Valerius, brought to his knees not by force, but by a woman. He savored it. He revised his demands upward, greed mixing with triumph. The negotiation became a protracted, brutal dissection of Leo's assets, broadcast securely to his inner circle as a humiliation. And all the while, Leo's first set of orders were in motion. The digital footprint of the safe house's security system, the pattern of food deliveries, the cell phone pings of a lower-level guard who'd gotten careless, the surgical strike was finding its target. As Dante finalized the terms of what he believed was Leo's surrender, Marco's team, acting on the triangulated location, was moving in. They didn't storm the building. They became the building, posing as city inspectors, as a rival crew buying off the guards, as a silent, digital ghost in the machine that turned off the lights and opened the doors. Back in the club, Leo pushed the drafted agreement across the table. "Sign it. She walks free the moment my lawyer verifies the transfers begin." Dante, grinning, picked up the pen. It was the moment Leo's team had waited for, the moment of maximum distraction, when Dante's focus was on his victory lap. Juliet, in her featureless room, heard the shouts, the scuffles, the sudden silence. Her door opened. It was not Dante, or one of his men. It was Marco, his face grim, a trickle of fresh blood on his temple. "Time to go, Miss Vance." The escape was a blur of back stairwells and waiting cars. She was bundled inside, and the car did not speed away in a dramatic screech. It pulled into traffic, anonymous and calm. Only when they were miles away, merging onto the highway back towards the Valerius Tower, did she see the cost. On the tablet in the back seat, a news alert flashed: a fire at the Metropolis Club, cause unknown. Significant structural damage. No reports of injuries, but the historic building's main dining wing was destroyed. Leo had not traded his empire. He had set a part of it, a tangible symbol of his own legitimacy and history, ablaze as the ultimate distraction. He had paid a price, but not the one Dante demanded. He had sacrificed a piece of his world to buy back the one piece that, to his own shocking realization, had become the center of it. When the car descended into the familiar underground garage, and the elevator rose to the penthouse, the doors opened onto a different man. Leo stood waiting, the agreement with Dante, now worthless ash in a burning club, discarded. He looked exhausted to his soul, the weight of the violence and the gamble etched into every line of his face. He didn't reach for her. He simply said, his voice ragged with a vulnerability she had never heard, "The choice I gave you before, it was a lie. There is no leaving. Not anymore. Not for me. But you can walk away. Your debt is gone. Your mother is safe. You can leave tonight, and I will ensure Dante never touches you. Or you can stay. In the fire. With me." He offered her not a cage, but a conflagration. Not safety, but a shared descent into the violent truth he had unleashed for her. The choice was finally, terrifyingly, her own. The penthouse, once a symbol of sterile control, now felt like the still, charged air after a lightning strike. The scent of smoke from the distant Metropolis Club fire seemed to have seeped into the very marble, a phantom reminder of the price paid. Leo's offer hung between them, not as a command, but as a raw, exposed nerve. He stood motionless, his usual armor of certainty shattered, revealing the stark, uncompensated cost of his choice. He had not bartered his empire, he had immolated a piece of it as a pyre to light her path home. In his eyes, she saw the terrifying truth: the most powerful man in the city was powerless before her decision. Juliet did not move towards the door, nor did she move towards him. She stood in the space that had been her cage, her workshop, her battleground, and now, her crucible. The ghost of the safe house's bland terror was still on her skin, but it was overlaid with the memory of Marco's bloodied, determined face in the doorway, and the cataclysmic act of arson Leo had committed as a diversion. He had redefined the terms. It was no longer about protection from the old Bruise, or about the transactional repair of a painting. It was about the visceral, undeniable fact that he had chosen her over his own inviolable rule of power. He had introduced chaos into his own kingdom to retrieve her. Her gaze drifted past him, to the open door of her studio. The portrait sat on the easel, complete. The boy's face was whole, the violent slash now nothing but a knowledge in her mind and, perhaps, in the density of the paint. She had performed the alchemy he'd spoken of. She had taken broken history and made it appear seamless. But she was not a painting. She could not have her damage simply in-painted and vanish. It was part of her grain, her texture. And he, the man who had added his own bruises to her skin, had also proven he would burn down landmarks to pull her from the dark. She thought of Elena's devastated comprehension, of the clean, safe life that was still a possibility. A life of restored canvases in a quiet studio, free of the scent of gunpowder and the shadow of vengeance. It was a beautiful, peaceful ghost. And then she thought of the brutal honesty in this gilded prison. The way he saw every crack in her and called it strength. The way their war had become her war. The way his obsession had, somehow, forged a terrifying mirror of her own. "The painting is finished," she said, her voice sounding strange in the silent room. "The boy's face is whole." Leo's eyes flickered, waiting. This was not an answer. She walked past him, not to the exit, but into the studio. She stood before her work, then reached for a clean, fine sable brush and a small dish. She did not touch the portrait. Instead, she went to her supply cabinet and retrieved a small, unused canvas panel. With a steady hand, she mixed a color, not from the historical palette of the portrait, but a modern, raw umber. On the fresh panel, she painted a single, deliberate, vertical line. Then, with meticulous, painstaking strokes, she began to feign a repair around it. She built up layers, matched textures, not to erase the line, but to highlight the meticulous, visible labor of its mending. It was a metaportrait, an artwork about the act of restoration itself, declaring the scar as part of the final piece. She felt him enter the studio and stop behind her, watching. She did not turn. "You asked if I could make the damage disappear," she said, her focus on her brushwork. "I can. But that's a lie. A forgery of history. The truth is in the repair, not in the illusion." She finally set the brush down and turned to face him. His face was unreadable, a monument under siege. "You can't give me a world without marks, Leo. You've already left your own. So have I. So has everyone. The choice isn't between a bruised life and a safe one. It's about whose chaos you choose. Whose scars you recognize as part of your story." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the faint, weary lines around his eyes, the pulse in his throat. She took his hand, the hand that had signed death warrants, and traced the line of her cheek, and turned it over. With her thumb, she brushed across his knuckles, over the faint scars there, old, violent histories written on his skin. "I'm not leaving," she said, the words final, sealing a pact more binding than any debt contract. "But I am not staying as your restoration project. I am staying as your partner in the damage. You burn down clubs, I'll forge the documents to cover it. You start a war, I'll find the weakness in your enemy's armor. You look at me and see something unbroken? Look again. See the crack. And see the hand holding it together. That's the bargain. Not sanctuary. Alliance." For a long moment, Leo was silent, his hand tight around hers. The vulnerability in his eyes hardened, not into coldness, but into a ferocious, dawning respect. She had not accepted his world, she had claimed a share in its creation and its defense. She had moved from the position of protected asset to strategist. He saw the intelligence in her plan, the ruthless practicality beneath her artistry. She was offering not her submission, but her skill, the same skill that had hidden a slash in canvas could hide 1,000 other sins. He pulled her to him then, but the kiss was different. It was not a claiming, but a ratification. It was hard, hungry, and filled with the dark promise of a shared future. It tasted of smoke and resolve. "The bruise," he murmured against her lips, his voice thick with a possessiveness that was now a mutual pact. "The original one. It's gone." She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. "It's not gone. It's just part of the painting now." She saw the understanding flash in his eyes. Her history, his violence, their collision, it was all pigment layered into the complex, darkened masterpiece of them. He nodded, a general accepting a formidable new lieutenant. "Then we have work to do. Dante will not see this as a draw. He will see it as an act of war." "I know," Juliet said, a strange calm settling over her. The fear had been burned away, leaving a cool, sharp clarity. "He uses political connections. I spent 6 months restoring a portrait for a senator's wife. She owes me a favor. Let me make a call." A ghost of a smile, the first true one she had ever seen, touched Leo's mouth. It was a terrifying and beautiful thing. He released her, his hand sliding to the small of her back, a gesture of solidarity and possession both. Together, they walked out of the studio, leaving the restored boy and the new, meta-portrait of a scar behind them. The gilded cage was gone. In its place was a command center, and she had just volunteered for the front lines. The city's skyline beyond the windows was no longer a diorama of a world she was kept from. It was a chessboard, and she had just picked up a piece. Her first move would be a phone call. His would be a mobilization. The war was not over, it was entering a new, more dangerous phase. And the bruised bargain was sealed not with a signature, but with a mutual, unspoken vow. They would face the coming fire together, their scars not weaknesses to be hidden, but the very bonds that held their dark, formidable alliance together. Did you survive the collision of obsession and art? The world of dark bargains and deeper loyalties is vast. If you crave more stories where love is a battlefield and power is the ultimate currency, delve deeper. Subscribe for future tales woven in shadow.